Welcome to Today in the Hypothesis. If you are joining us right now, we are so glad you're here.
Yeah, really glad to have you with us for this one.
Today, we're taking a deep dive into a topic that, honestly, it permeates our culture. It fills up entire bookstore shelves, and yet, it remains profoundly misunderstood by almost everyone.
Completely misunderstood.
We are talking about self-love, but, and this is important, before you roll your eyes at the thought of, another self-help cliche or visualize bubble baths and trendy hashtags, stick around.
Right, because we are approaching this through a radically different lens today.
Exactly. We are framing self-love as a rigorous scientific and philosophical investigation.
So the source material guiding our deep dive today is this really comprehensive, heavily researched report. It's titled The Ontological Foundation of Self-Love, an interdisciplinary validation of the worthiness hypothesis.
It's quite a title.
It is a mouthful, yeah. But what makes this document so compelling is its sheer scope. It doesn't just look at psychology. It synthesizes evolutionary psychology, neurobiology, sociology, economic theory, and even the core tenets of major world religions.
All to answer one fundamental question about human nature, right? Our intrinsic value.
Exact.
So our mission for this deep dive is to deconstruct a concept the report calls the unworthy self. We are going to examine the evidence suggesting that learning to love yourself is actually not some grand achievement of egoic perfection.
No, you don't have to go meditate on a mountain for 10 years or achieve flawless self-esteem.
Right. It is simply the biological and spiritual recognition of a pre-existing state of value. And the premise here is just staggering for you as the listener. You do not become worthy. You simply admit that you already are.
And when we connect this directly to the everyday experience of you, the listener, the stakes become very, very clear. Because we all feel this immense pressure to somehow earn our space in the world, right?
Oh, absolutely.
We hustle at our jobs. We carefully curate our images on social media. We just exhaust ourselves trying to prove to others and to ourselves that we matter.
Yeah, it's a constant performance.
But the overarching thesis of this research is that your own brain, your evolutionary history, and thousands of years of human philosophy all point to the fact that worthiness is actually your default setting. The feeling of unworthiness is just an acquired illusion.
So to understand how we acquire that illusion, I think we really need to start at the beginning. Let's look at the evolutionary and biological alarm bells of unworthiness.
The deep past.
Right. For humans living in the ancestral environment of the Pleistocene epoch, survival was inherently a group project. You just could not survive alone.
Impossible.
If you were deemed worthy by your tribe, you got shared resources, protection from predators, a chance to reproduce. But if you were deemed unworthy, you faced social exclusion.
And in that environment, being exiled from the tribe wasn't just a blow to your ego. It was functionally a death sentence.
A literal death sentence.
Yeah. And that ancient survival mechanism, it operates identically in us today, even though our environment has changed completely.
Which brings us to what the report highlights as sociometer theory, right?
Right, sociometer theory. This fundamentally changes how we view our own confidence. The theory suggests that what you perceive as your self-esteem isn't actually an end goal, nor is it an accurate measure of your true human value.
It's just a tool.
It is literally just an internal gauge, a sociometer designed by evolution to monitor your social standing.
So your mind is just constantly running these background processes.
Exactly. It's scanning your environment for cues of acceptance or rejection. So when you feel a sudden, crushing dip in self-esteem, that is just your biological dashboard flashing a warning light. It's telling you that your inclusionary status in the group might be threatened.
And the research details just how extreme this need to belong really is. It overrides almost everything else. There are studies in the sources showing that people often prefer the company of complete strangers over being alone.
Just to get a minimal psychological buffer against isolation.
Yeah. And when we experience social exclusion, say you get left off a meeting invite or a friend ignores your text, it literally activates the physical pain pathways in the brain.
It's incredible.
The brain processes a social snub with the exact same alarm system it uses for a broken bone or a physical burn.
Because it's an evolutionary driver trying to force you to correct behaviors that might get you kicked out of the group.
Right.
That intense impulsivity or anger or that feeling of worthlessness you get after a rejection, it's supposed to be painful. So you will immediately fix the social rupture. The human brain treats social connection with the exact same urgency as food and water.
So if social pain registers as physical pain, what is actually happening chemically in the brain when we feel that sense of worthlessness versus when we feel secure?
Well, the neurochemical landscape is deeply tied to how we perceive our worth. Let's start with serotonin. You can think of serotonin as your emotional armor. It provides executive control, allowing your prefrontal cortex to override the lower-level, impulsive reactions of your amygdala.
So it keeps you from overreacting.
Exactly. If you have a healthy, stable serotonergic system, you can receive external criticism and process it objectively. You don't internalize it as definitive proof that you are worthless.
You just see it as feedback.
Right. And then you have dopamine, which is the brain's reward system. When you engage in self-affirming behaviors or build a warm connection with someone, dopamine reinforces that survival behavior with a powerful sense of pleasure and satisfaction.
But what happens when someone is chronically isolated? I mean, if society or their circumstances have made them feel entirely unworthy, they aren't getting those natural dopamine rewards.
And that is a critical vulnerability. When an individual's sense of social belonging is exceptionally low, their biological need for that dopamine hit doesn't just vanish. The brain still demands it.
So they have to look elsewhere.
Consequently, they seek out artificial rewards.
Yeah.
The research correlates low self-worth directly with substance abuse, compulsive consumption, binge eating, and other addictive behaviors.
Wow.
These are all attempts to step in and chemically compensate for the lack of natural reward signaling that should be coming from feeling worthy and safely connected to a community.
And beyond serotonin and dopamine, the sources also dig into oxytocin and vasopressin, specifically in relation to how we view ourselves.
Yeah, oxytocin is fascinating here.
It's widely known as the bonding hormone, right? Released during positive social interactions like physical touch or shared laughter. But in the context of self-love, it does something far more profound than just making us feel warm and fuzzy.
It actually modulates the dopamine.
Right. It shifts the brain's operations. It takes us out of a competitive ego state where we are constantly fighting for status and comparing ourselves to others. And it moves us into a compassionate state that recognizes common humanity.
You stop seeing yourself as an isolated unit that has to defeat others to be valuable.
Exactly. You start seeing yourself as a valued, integral participant in a wider network.
And that shift from that competitive, status-driven ego to a compassionate, connected self-position, it highlights the danger of what clinical psychology calls the contingency trap.
The contingency trap. Let's get into that.
This is the vital difference between self-esteem and self-worth. Many people, and even some psychological frameworks, confuse the two. But that confusion is highly destructive to our mental health.
A really helpful way to visualize the difference is to think of self-esteem as the daily stock market.
That's a great analogy.
It's evaluative, highly conditional, and entirely based on external factors. It rises and falls based on your professional success, your physical appearance, your bank account, getting a promotion.
It's always fluctuating.
Because it relies on external metrics, self-esteem is incredibly fragile. You are forced into an exhausting, lifelong cycle of proving your value every single day.
And the danger of relying on that evaluative esteem is that failure is inevitable. When you eventually miss an external standard, when the stock market crashes, to use your analogy, your self-esteem plummets.
And how do people usually react to that?
Well, it almost always leads to defensive, destructive reactions. The sources actually provide a really fascinating historical context for how we've understood this defense mechanism.
Oh, right. The history of narcissism?
Yeah. In the late 19th century, narcissism was viewed quite narrowly, mostly as a sexual perversion. Then Freud introduced the idea of normal narcissism as a necessary survival-based investment in the self.
Which makes sense from a survival standpoint.
Sure. But skip ahead to the 1970s through the intense debates of psychologists like Heinz Kohut and Otto Kernberg, and narcissism became a dominant clinical theme regarding how humans handle insecurity.
Leading right up to the DSM-3.
Exactly. Narcissistic personality disorder was codified in the DSM-3 in 1980, and it was recognized essentially as a pathology of fragile self-esteem regulation.
So the grandiosity and the arrogance we associate with narcissism.
It is actually just a desperate, heavily armored defense mechanism used to protect a deeply insecure, conditional self-concept.
Wait, let me play devil's advocate for you, the listener, for a second. Isn't some level of conditional self-esteem or self-criticism necessary to improve ourselves? I mean, if we don't feel a sting when we fail, how do we ever get better at our jobs or as partners?
It's a really common misconception that self-acceptance breeds complacency. but the difference lies in correction versus flagellation.
Oh, okay, pack that.
If you make a mistake at work, objective self-correction says, I used the wrong data in this report. I need to double-check my sources next time. That's healthy.
Right.
But evaluative self-esteem turns that into, I used the wrong data. I'm an incompetent fraud who doesn't deserve this job.
Ah, that is the flagellation.
Yes, and this is why the research points toward global self-worth as the gold standard. Self-worth is the deep, unwavering knowing of your value that remains constant regardless of circumstances. It acts as mental and emotional armor.
And the sources show that popular self-help tools, like positive affirmations, they only work if you already possess a baseline of self-worth, right?
Yes, that's a huge point. If you are deeply convinced you are unworthy, repeating, I am a successful winner in the mirror, actually creates cognitive dissonance. It makes you feel worse.
Because your brain knows you don't believe it.
Exactly. You can achieve massive outward success, become a billionaire, and still feel completely unworthy of love if you are only running on the engine of self-esteem.
So the alternative to chasing this fragile, high self-esteem is practicing self-compassion.
Self-compassion, yeah.
It gives you the mental health benefits of confidence without the dark side of ego defensiveness or narcissistic grandiosity. It is simply acknowledging your shared humanity. You don't need to be uniquely special or above average to be valuable. Just being human is enough to warrant care and respect.
Exactly. But this raises a glaring issue. If being human is enough, why do so many of us feel so profoundly unworthy?
Right, where does it come from?
Our internal sense of worth doesn't develop in a vacuum. It is heavily shaped and in many ways exploited by the culture we live in.
Yeah.
We have to look at how society actively manufactures the unworthy self.
Yeah, if we are biologically wired to tie our worth to our tribe, how does the modern world, with all its cultural pressures, exploit that wiring?
Well, the sources point to the cultural divide between individualism and collectivism, not just as different ways of living, but as different ways of manipulating our sociometer.
Right. In individualistic cultures like the United States and Northern Europe, autonomy and personal achievement are the ultimate metrics of value. Your worth is tied to a performance identity.
You essentially have to earn your worthiness every single day through uniqueness, standing out, and achieving victory over competitors.
Conversely, in collectivist cultures, like those in East Asia or Latin America, the self is viewed as interdependent. Worthiness is found in social harmony, fulfilling your specific familial or societal role, and putting the collective first.
And in those societies, worth is deeply tied to avoiding losing face.
Which creates a very strong, stable sense of belonging. But failing to meet social expectations can trigger intense, paralyzing guilt and shame.
Exactly. But culture doesn't just divide these pressures by geography. It divides them sharply by gender.
The sources mention something called the individuation connection split when discussing gender socialization. What exactly is that splitting, and how does it affect our sense of worth?
It refers to the divergent paths of socialization we put children on from a very early age. Generally speaking, men are socially conditioned to find their worth in agency, independence, and power.
The underlying message being that worth comes from getting ahead and distinguishing oneself through achievements.
Right. Women, however, are socialized to find their worth in communion, caregiving, and attractiveness. The message there is that worth comes from getting along and maintaining attachments to others.
And this isn't just a vague societal feeling. The report highlights studies utilizing the conformity to masculine norms inventory. Can you explain what an inventory like that actually measures?
Sure. A psychological inventory like that measures how strongly an individual adheres to traditional cultural rules. For example, one of the norms it measures is the drive for winning at all costs, or the strict emotional control expected of men.
And what did the results show?
What the research found is astounding. Adhering strictly to these socialized norms physically alters cognitive frameworks over time. It actually changes how the brain processes information.
Physically alters it.
Yes. Men who highly conform to these rigid masculine norms show altered performance on low-level cognitive tasks involving spatial memory and theory of mind.
Theory of mind being the ability to understand others' emotional states.
Exactly. So the unworthy self isn't just a bad mood. It is a rigid cognitive framework built through years of neurological reinforcement.
And we see a similar restrictive framework for women. Self-stereotyping conforming strictly to those gender roles. It might offer a short-term boost in societal belonging, but it makes a person's worth incredibly conditional.
Highly conditional.
A stark example the report gives is how women internalize the media's thin ideal. When worth is intrinsically tied to an impossible standard of physical attractiveness, aging, or simply existing outside that narrow body type, acts as a constant daily threat to their perceived worthiness.
So to genuinely love yourself, you often have to actively, consciously reject the cultural messaging that ties your value exclusively to how accommodating you are or how much power you wield.
And that conscious rejection becomes even more vital when we examine the economics of worth, or how human value has been commodified.
Socioeconomic status, or SES, has a profound and measurable impact on what researchers call self-respect.
And self-respect here means the foundational philosophical belief that you possess the same equal rights and human dignity as anyone else in the room.
Right, and longitudinal studies demonstrate that a person's income level significantly predicts their level of self-respect over time.
That creates a tragic downward spiral. People with lower SES frequently internalize their lack of economic power as a lack of inherent human value.
And when people feel this intense deficit, they often try to compensate through materialism. They buy things they can't afford just to signal status.
But the research is crystal clear on this. Pursuing financial contingencies of self-worth actually leads to greater loneliness and social disconnection.
People sacrifice their relationships and community ties for financial gains or the illusion of wealth, which ultimately isolates them and erodes their internal worth even further.
How did we get to a place where we equate our bank accounts with our right to exist?
Sociologists trace this back to a massive historical shift. In the mid-20th century, individuals primarily anchored their identity in institutions.
Like family or work?
Right. Your worth came from being a reliable parent, a devout church member, or a dedicated worker in a community. But from the 1970s onward, there was a modal shift toward the impulse pull.
Meaning people began seeking their worth by expressing their inner desires and distinguishing themselves from the crowd.
Exactly. And consumer capitalism heavily capitalized on this shift. It began selling images, aesthetics, and lifestyles so people could literally buy their way to a real self. We fundamentally commodified worthiness.
Turning it into a product you have to constantly upgrade.
Right.
It's fascinating that while sociologists and neurobiologists are mapping this out right now, global religions have been loudly claiming that we possess inherent, unpurchasable worth for millennia.
The convergence here is beautiful.
The report refers to it as the ontological proof. Across wildly different theological traditions and thousands of years of human history, the core message remains shockingly consistent. Human worth is an inherent divine quality. It is the divine default.
Let's walk through how these different traditions arrive at that exact same conclusion. In Hinduism, you have the foundational concept of the Atman.
The supreme self.
Right. The Atman is the true innermost essence of a being, and it is considered identical to the ultimate divine reality of the universe. Your physical body and your social status might change, but the driver inside is pure, eternal, and infinitely valuable.
So self-love, in this context, is the profound realization of your own divinity. Summarized by the Sanskrit phrase tat tvamasi, or thou art that.
Then, in Buddhism, you have a seemingly opposite approach that leads to the exact same peace. The concept of anatta, or no self.
Right, instead of elevating the self to the divine, it dissolves the self altogether.
It teaches that the fragile, validation-seeking ego we talked about earlier, the one obsessing over the self-esteem stock market, it doesn't actually exist as a rigid, permanent thing. By realizing there is no isolated self to fiercely protect, you are freed from defending it. You find peace and worth in deep interconnectedness with all things.
Moving to the Abrahamic traditions, we see a similar developmental journey regarding the self. In Islam, there is the concept of the nafs, which translates to the self or the ego.
The spiritual journey there involves moving from the primitive, pleasure-seeking stage of the self through the reproaching conscience that feels guilt until it finally reaches the tranquil self.
And the tranquil self finds total peace and absolute worth in surrendering to the divine will. The purification of the heart strips away the need for societal validation, revealing inherent worth.
In Judaism, human worth is immediately anchored in the creation story, being made B'Tselem Elohim, which means in the image of God.
Because of this, human life has infinite, non-negotiable value.
There is also the beautiful mystical tradition of raising the divine sparks, or nitzitzat. It suggests that divine light is hidden inside every human being in every aspect of the material world. Our purpose is to recognize and elevate that inherent goodness.
And similarly, in Christianity, worthiness is explicitly framed as a love-based identity rooted entirely in grace. It is a gift freely given by the divine, fundamentally rejecting the idea that worth is based on merit, rule following, or earthly achievement.
What is remarkable is that whether you are looking at an fMRI brain scan showing oxytocin overriding the competitive ego, or reading ancient texts about the Atman or grace, the conclusion is identical. You do not have to earn your right to exist.
But practically speaking, how do we take evolutionary biology, sociological data, and thousands of years of spiritual wisdom and actually apply it on a random Tuesday morning when we are feeling terrible about ourselves?
A practical application.
Yeah, the sources pivot to a clinical bottom-up model to answer this.
Right. When we feel unworthy, we almost always fall into what clinical psychologists call the tree-FOSS cycle. TRILT stands for trigger, response, avoidance, problem.
Walk us through an example of that.
Let's say you get a highly critical email from your boss. That's the trigger. Your response is a crushing feeling of worthlessness and anxiety. To cope, you fall into avoidance. You cancel dinner plans with your friends and isolate yourself on the couch.
And the problem is that by avoiding connection, you deepen your isolation. You are entirely cutting off the dopamine and oxytocin you desperately need to feel better.
Exactly.
So how does the bottom-up solution break that cycle?
The clinical intervention is called behavioral activation, or BA. The philosophy is act first, feel later.
Act first, feel later.
When you are caught in the TRAP cycle, your brain is telling you to hide. Behavioral activation requires you to schedule small, value-concordant tasks, even and especially when you don't feel like doing them. You force yourself to go to that dinner with friends, or you spend 20 minutes working in the garden.
That reframes the entire concept of self-care. You aren't waiting for inspiration or a sudden burst of confidence. You deliberately treat yourself as someone whose time, relationships, and goals are deeply valuable.
And eventually, your brain's chemistry catches up to your actions. This creates an upward spiral of dopamine.
And modern research shows that engaging in this kind of self-compassionate behavior actually changes the physical architecture of your brain. It increases the gray matter in your prefrontal cortex, which directly enhances your ability to regulate negative emotions in the future.
Another incredibly practical, evidence-based tool mentioned in the clinical section is mirror work.
Mirror work. I know it sounds almost too simple to be true.
It does sound simple, but standing in front of a mirror and intentionally using positive, compassionate self-talk directly targets the brain's inner critic. By looking yourself in the eye and offering grace, you are intentionally utilizing neuroplasticity.
You're actively rewiring your mental programming.
Forcing your nervous system to shift from a state of threat and isolation into a state of safety and self-compassion.
Let's bring all of these threads together for a final synthesis. The core realization of this entire deep dive into the research is this: the unworthy self is largely a historical and social construct.
It is an evolutionary alarm bell designed to keep you safe in a Pleistocene tribe, which has been hijacked by modern society to regulate your behavior, enforce gender norms, and sell you products.
Learning to love yourself is actually the profound act of unlearning that standard of comparison. You do not need to read another self-help book to become worthy. You simply need to admit that you already are.
And this leaves us with a provocative implication for you to take away today. Think about the massive societal transformation that would happen if we all truly accepted our worthiness.
It would be huge.
If we reject the contingent worth sold to us by consumer capitalism and gender stereotypes, self-love stops being just a feel-good self-help mantra. It actually becomes a foundational, almost revolutionary act of gaining the self-respect needed to act as powerful moral agents in our communities.
That is a staggering thought. Recognizing our worth isn't just an internal victory, it's the foundation of how we show up and change the world. I cannot think of a better place to leave it.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thank you so much for exploring this research with us. If this conversation sparked a realization for you, please subscribe to Today in the Hypothesis so you never miss a deep dive. And more importantly, share this specific conversation with someone in your life who might need a reminder of their own inherent, unshakable value today. We will catch you next time.